All right, welcome back everyone. So sorry for the break in transmission. So we're going to continue from where we stopped. Before the break in transmission, I completed the analysis of the African drama and then the non-African drama. So now I'm going to just move to the non-African prose work that we have. And this is Suzanne Bellefleury's Path of Lucas, The Journey He Endured. So the first thing you have to bear in mind about this prose text is that it is an autobiography, an autobiographical novel to be exact. And when we're talking about the difference between an autobiography and an autobiographical novel, a lot of aspirants and admission seekers get to make mistakes with all of these things. So I'll just quickly explain. When we talk about an autobiography is the story of a person's life written by that same person. But when it comes to an autobiographical novel, we're talking about a prose work, a prose narrative that talks about the story of one's life written by that same person, but with fictionalized elements. For example, instead of putting the person's actual name in the text, you get to use another name. You get to, for example, put diverse locations for things that are away from what really happened. But one thing you would know that an autobiographical novel has is that the main element of what happened in history, the main plot is real or aligns with reality. Now, in this text, you find out that the representation of Suzanne in the representation of Suzanne in Path of Lucas is Lucy. Lucy is a representation of Suzanne, but in the text we do not have it as Suzanne. And this text just gets to talk about the lives of some set of individuals, because majorly Suzanne Bellefleury went through a whole lot of things. Our family dynamics and other set of things really played a lot of role in what's happened in this work. And you would realize that in the family structure was one that was very large, because one thing was very much recurrent, and that was the idea of teenage pregnancy. Teenage pregnancy was really a thing, because in the text you find out that Isabel, there's a lady Isabel, there's Lucas. The main character in the work is Lucas. Lucas was a very young individual of about 17, and then at a point he saw this lady Isabel, and when they got together they eventually got married and other things, and they gave birth to 5 children. And after giving birth to 5 children, the family went through a whole lot of things, ranging from death to illnesses, psychotic depressions, and other things. And Suzanne Bellefleury wrote this work based on a personal reality, based on what really happened in her life. So in Path of Lucas, you would find out that there is a major character who is Lucas. We see a representation of what happened in the life of Lucas from the beginning to the end. The work has a total of 35 chapters, and throughout these 35 chapters, you get to realize how different things play out. So at the beginning of the text, you see that Lucy, the only daughter that Lucas and Isabel gave birth to, she's now grown, she has married and all of that. Although she gave birth while she got pregnant while she was a teenager, but that's past. She's from Alexandria, and the family resided actually in Alexandria at a particular point, or almost throughout their lives. And something happened. She was on the way to visiting her father from Kingstown, heading to Alexandria. But on her way, she had an accident, and then she was taken to the hospital. She was in coma at the time. So her family was contacted, her husband, her children, they were all contacted, and they came around. And her father was even contacted. He also came around. So he sat by his daughter, wondering if his daughter was going to recover from the coma or not. But while he was doing all of these things, he then decided to tell the story of his life with the hope that Lucy was going to hear all of the things he was saying. So he sat down there and then started his narration. From how he was a young individual, how he started life, another thing, as father, mother. He saw Isabel and he got married to Isabel. They had 5 children, and he had a particular friend named Steve. Steve had a dream of being in the Air Force, and eventually he got into the Air Force. So whenever Steve comes back to Alexandria, he comes to tell Lucas that Lucas should not throw away his dream just to serve his parents. Majorly because Lucas has this urge in mind to become a mechanic. He has the dream to become a mechanic. but he is held down by the family occupation, which is farming. Assist his father with farming and other things. He even got to a point, he got an opportunity from somebody. He got an opportunity from somebody to be to come to a particular college, Oxbridge, yes, to come to Oxbridge, and he would learn to become a certified mechanic in a college, while he also assists that friend in the friend's workshop. He went with his family, he moved with his family, his wife and his children. But after some time, his father comes to meet him to tell him that that's the father, is now very weak to carry out farm activities. And he doesn't want all of their effort, all of the things that they did, that they put together, to just die off in that way. He wants everything to be reserved and for all of their efforts to really pay off at that point. And while all of these things were happening, he then discussed it with his wife, and you realize that Lucas left his dream to become a mechanic and went back to Alexandria to meet his father in order to take charge of the farming business. So after some time, things continue in a very steady manner. But it's something you should note that Lucas' friend Steve died after he came to Alexandria and was heading back. He had an air crash. There was a plane crash, and then he eventually died. And after all of these things happened, a series of other bad happenstances happened afterwards. Richard had thyroid cancer. He died. And then there was Isabel's sister, elder sister, France. She died of obesity. And the same obesity was what characterized Isabel too. And then it got to a point, Isabel was even diagnosed of having psychotic depression. Got to a point, she totally forgot all of the things she knew, forgot about her family, could not recognize anybody. And during this period, Lucas had gotten a job at a cable company. And at that cable company, he was actually doing well, the family was doing fine. But because of what his wife was going through, he left the job to be able to take care of her. And then gradually, she started remembering the people around her, activities and other things, and it was as though the family was coming together. It was also during that period that Lucas' mother died. His father also died after some time. It was almost during that period when Lucy comes back home. Lucy comes back home to state that she's pregnant at the age of 16. And then there's also Richard. Richard also impregnated a girl around that same period, Chelsea, and that pregnancy was already about 6 months. So at that point, the family was going through quite a number of things. After Chelsea had the child, Richard was diagnosed of this thyroid cancer. It was treated, and eventually it was diagnosed again that the cancer moved somewhere else, and eventually he died. And after all of these things happened, it eventually got to a point where Isabel became very, very sick, and she had an heart attack. She had a heart attack, and she was taken to the hospital, but eventually she didn't survive it. So Isabel, Lucas's wife, also died. So you realize that throughout all of the things that happened in this text, there were a lot of trying times for Lucas, because it was at the core, at the crux of all of the happenstances. He was the one majorly affected, because every single activity or every single death that took place or that happened in the novel revolved around him, affected Lucas in that sense. So you just realize that this work, part of Lucas, the journey he endured, really talks about the kind of journey he endured. Because there is one thing that JAMB does at times in the UTME exam. They would ask you for significance of titles, and the significance of this particular title can be found in how we get an analysis of the journey or the life of the life of Lucas, how he started out, how he continued up to the point where he was. So there is something in literature called a cyclic plot style. And when you're talking about a cyclic plot, it's talking about a kind of plot that, according to his name, tends to move in a form of circle. So in a cyclic plot, the story gets to start at a point that feels like it is almost at the end. Because at the beginning of the novel, you see that Lucy had an accident. And when she had that accident, Lucas was there talking to her. But while Lucas was talking to her, you know, if you have to go in a normal scheme of things, things should go forward. But this narrative goes back to explain what happened in the past, takes us back to when Lucas was 16. And then the narrative just continues to brew, and then go on. And eventually it gets to a point, it comes back to the present, after Lucas tells all of his story. So when the narrative comes back to the present, we now realize that Lucy was revived from this coma, and then she was alive. Everybody was happy that she was already alive. So Lucas stepped out to place a call, but on his way back, he noticed that his heart stopped pumping, and he thought it was something minute. But before he got to the door of where the ward where his daughter was, he fell down there, and Lucas died. So Lucas died after receiving the news, or after seeing that his daughter already survived at that point. And that was the end of Lucas's journey at that point in time. So you just realize that the novel itself provides us with an analysis of a journey of someone's life, because the novel provides this existential statement, a statement of how life is a stream of sorrow with little punctuations of joy in it. And we find the representation of this thing vividly in the life of Lucas, where the times when Lucas was unhappy far outweighs the times he was happy about things and about life, because he was always moving from one struggle to another thing, always looking for ways to sort them out. But as I stated earlier, this work is an autobiographical novel, meaning it's heavily dependent on the experiences of Susan Bellefeuille and what happened in her family. So while reading the text, just ensure you pay attention to the way the work is structured, how it is autobiographical in nature. Also pay attention to how it's a Canadian work and the influence of the hybridity of cultures in that sense, where you have a sort of English-speaking culture, French-speaking culture, because in the narrative, you find out that Lucas is more of the English-speaking individual, while Isabel was a French-speaking individual. So this work tries to provide this hybridity that characterized Canada at that particular time. And then it was also, around this period was also the baby boomers generation, where people believed, it was after the Second World War, people believed giving birth to so much individuals, even though they reside in a very clamped up space, gets to build family unity and things among them. That's why you see that Lucas and Isabel had 5 children, and then they had a lot of other individuals, because when the lady Chelsea that Richard impregnated gave birth to the child, they were all staying in the same house within, just staying within the, that same unit of family bonding in that sense. So these are the things that you should actually bear in mind while reading Path of Lucas. So that brings me to the end of the analysis of the non-African prose works that we have. So we'll move on to the poems. And for the poems now, the first one that we have here is Gabriel Okara's Once Upon a Time. And for Gabriel Okara's Once Upon a Time, you have an explanation of how. Okay, firstly, bear in mind that this poem is a sort of dramatic monologue. When we're talking about dramatic monologue, we're talking about a kind of poem that you have somebody speaking in a sort of dramatic form, and the person is addressing other individuals. But those individuals that are being addressed cannot provide response. But you know that someone is there. Because throughout the explanation of this text, there is the repetition of the word son. And the poet Passina tries to, the poet Passina is highly nostalgic. That's one thing you should bear in mind also. The poet Passina is highly nostalgic in the sense that the poet Passina provides us with a representation of things, how things used to be before and how they are tenable in the present world. So throughout the poem, you find out that the poet Passina was explaining that there used to be a time when people would genuinely be happy for themselves, happy for other individuals, and life will go on in a very blissful form and a very blissful manner. But at the present moment, things are now different. People no longer relate with themselves on the basis of the real love and care that they have for themselves. But individuals relate on that plane of what they could benefit from certain relationships and all of that. And these issues kind of continue and begins to get worse, because the poet Passina, at a point in the poem, was saying something like, whenever you visit individuals, the first time they tell you feel at home, the second time you can come around, the third time they get to shut the door at your face. Now, this is a representation of what exists in the modern society. But then the poet Passina now says at the last stanza of the poem that he wishes to go back to this past age. He wants to go back to this past era when things used to be seamless, when things used to just be free and very genuine. And he sees a representation of what used to be in that individual he is addressing as the son in the text. So you just find out that, in essence, this poem, Once Upon a Time by Gabriel Okara, just provides us with a representation of what used to be and then what is in the current state of things, and how the poet persona is longing towards that particular thing that used to be in the past. So that explains Gabriel Okara's Once Upon a Time. And then there's Elizabeth Kamara's New Tongue. So for Elizabeth Kamara's New Tongue, it's still a poem that juxtaposes or gets to compare things, what used to be and then what is. So now in this particular poem, New Tongue, you find out that Elizabeth Kamara talks about how people have neglected their own languages, their own custom, their own proper and original way of life to embrace cultures that aren't theirs, cultures that they have nothing in relation to. So people leave their own cultures and then embrace other cultures that are seen as out of space or out of the ordinary. Where, for example, Africans, instead of embracing their own cultures, their custom, and the things that are indigenous to them, would rather go for things that are European, things that are foreign, because most of those things have a sort of legitimacy amongst these individuals. But the poet persona takes a tone of condemnation, in the sense that the poet persona speaks down on this way of doing things and how it is not something that ought to be done. So while pitching these two state of things, a state of the normal customs of these individuals are embracing, the poet persona leans more towards the way of life that it should be embraced more. That bearing that, for example, lots of African countries were colonized, and due to this colonization, they experienced lots of things where there was this cultural hybridity and all of that. But aside all of these things, the poet persona still believes that conscious and considerate effort should be made towards upholding the traditional custom and ways of life that actually exist. Where, for example, the situation has gotten so despicable or deplorable to the point where people are able to master and then speak well in foreign languages, and their own personal mother tongues, they are not apt in these languages. So basically, you find out that that is what Elizabeth Kamara is saying in New Tongue. So the next one is Wole Soyinka's Night. In Nights by Wole Soyinka, firstly, you find out that this poem is written in a sort of language that is quite deep and complex to an extent. You should note is that night is personified. Night is personified as an element or something that means a whole lot of things. Because within the concept of night, you find out how the poet persona sees night as something that he fears. He sees night as an entity that exists, that should be feared or that should be submitted, that one should submit to. And you do some set of analysis on Wole Soyinka's Night, and you will see that those analyses would relate what the poem is talking about to issues that were predominant during the military regime in Nigeria, where at a particular point in time, Soyinka himself was jailed. But during all of this period, according to what some of these analyses explain, this period are seen as night, a period that is feared, and a lot of things get to happen. So you would find out that in this poem, Nights by Wole Soyinka, a lot of things are explained about how night exists on its own. It's an element that one cannot fully grasp, because night has within it diverse things, concepts of how it should be feared, how it doesn't just exist on a normal plane, and how it has a lot of things involved in it. And towards the end of the poem, you realize that the poet persona explains that he now has to submit to the concept of night, because night is not something he can escape from. Also, there is this idea of how the poem talks about night from a lens of how night is a time when very hideous activities happen and then take place. Where, for example, there are certain activities, certain illicit activities that cannot happen during the day, but would take total preeminence during the night. The poet persona takes it from this perspective too. But towards the end of the poem, the last stanza to be specific, you find out that the poet persona subjects himself and submits to the concept of night, with the hope that eventually night would reach its climax and there would eventually be a sort of dawn. But that dawn that the poet persona talks about at the last part of the poem is quite ambiguous, in the sense that the dawn could mean a transition from the world to an afterlife, or a new era or new set of things happening. But throughout the poem, you just realize that night is personified as a very complex concept that has within it very diverse interpretations and things it could actually mean for individuals that are entrapped within its cycle. So that explains Night by Wole Soyinka. Next one is Knee Your Shoulder Raise, Not My Business. Knee Your Shoulder Raise, Not My Business talks about how the idea of complacency and apathy doesn't pay off at the end of the day. Because the poet personal talks from a lens of a person who believes what affects other individuals would not affect him. And the poem does something very peculiar or something very spectacular that you need to pay attention to. The characters that are mentioned in the poem are characters that cut across the 3 tribes in the country. So, for example, when a character was picked up in a jeep and was beaten like a clay, just the way the poem said it, the poet personal believed he is not affected by it. Now, there are certain concepts that are repeated in the work, and that's the idea of, there's this concept of the jeep, and then there's this idea of yam. Now, there's this jeep is a representation of a sort of draconian government, that suppresses dissent opinions and doesn't allow for people to speak. You would understand if you read the poem that the kind of government there is not a democratic government at all. So you'd find out that this jeep is a representation of that. And the poet personal, whenever something happens to people around him, when the Yoruba individual was beaten and then was abducted, when the Igbo individual was sacked for no just reason, when the Hausa individual was also arrested, he says one thing. He says, how is that his business? It is not my business, so long as it doesn't affect his yam. Now, the yam here is a representation of his own satisfaction, his own peace of mind, and his own interest in things. That so long as his own things are not affected, then he is good to go. But then, there is a sort of surprising turn in the poem, where at the beginning of stanza 4, we see that this poet personal is in his house, about to put his yam. You know, yam here now has become very symbolic, not just the physical yam. He's about to put the yam in his mouth, but then he suddenly sees that a jeep arrives. Meaning, all of the things he has been saying before, stating that issues affecting people around him are not his business, those things are actually his business, as they've come to haunt him now. So in general, you just find out that what Knee Your Shoulder Raise is trying to drive home with Not My Business is the fact that really things that are addressed as not being individuals' business get to a point, they become this individual's interest. And as such, people should not hold an indifferent perspective or an indifferent stance to issues that affect them in the society. Meaning, individuals should be very much involved in activities that concern them. Because what affects Party A could eventually come to affect Party Z sooner or later. So that's the message in Knee Your Shoulder Raise, Not My Business. So we'll move to the next poem, which is S.O.H. Afriye's Atigallant. So in Atigallant by S.O.H. Afriye, you see that one major message there is that there is an individual, an 85-year-old birthday celebrant who is alive. And please note, the poet personal in Atigallant is not the celebrant. The poet personal is somebody who is observing the celebrant, or who sees the celebrant as a sort of hero. And throughout this poem, you realize that the poet personal says that age that the celebrant has gotten to is a peak of achievement, where the poet personal, the celebrant has achieved a whole lot of things in his life to be able to attain that point he has attained in life already. So all of these ideas are expressed in the poem, ideas of how this man has been, the celebrant has been through a lot of things, has experienced diverse things, diverse realities, and all of these realities have shaped a lot of things about him. Bearing that at that age that he has now attained, he is no longer scared. He's no longer scared of failure or scared of other things. He has seen everything about life. And towards the end of the poem, the poet personal says that at this point, the birthday celebrant, the 85-year-old birthday celebrant, can now take on new things to accomplish in his life. Things about little goals that he can accomplish, and those goals will eventually be the ones he would accomplish as the final ones for his life before he goes into the afterlife. So you just understand that majorly this poem carries a very celebratory tone. And after this, we move to the last African poem that we have here, which is S.Y. Ocheni's The Breast of the Sea. Now for The Breast of the Sea, you would understand that this poem is talking about very diverse concepts. A concept of how the sea as a personified element also has been put through a lot of things. The sea has been caused to go through diverse things. Where at the point in the poem, the poet Fasina was saying things about how the sea has always been there from the time of Noah to the time when to the very recent century, the world wars and other things. But then while all of these things are happening, because if you examine the concept of the sea is a mysterious element, a mysterious entity. But if you examine the concept of the breast that is mentioned in the poem, you see that breast has to do with nurturing, a sort of motherhood or womanhood in that sense. So the juxtaposition of these two ideas would give you this sense of how the poem itself is talking about how, although the sea has been through a lot of things, it still has that nurturing quality that exists in it. And the sea has been very much advantageous to diverse individuals. But the poet Fasina, who is a Sierra Leonean, explains that the case is different in Sierra Leone, where it is as though the case of the Sierra Leoneans or the people of Sierra Leone has now gotten to a point where they feel damned, where there are no solutions to the things that beset them, where although the sea is very much nurturing and represents very different ideas, the situation of things doesn't look quite promising in Sierra Leone. So eventually you just find out that throughout this poem, the poet Fasina provides a sort of juxtaposition between what is tenable within certain African countries, particularly Sierra Leone, and the European countries that exist. So I think that explains the last African poem that we have here. So moving to the non-African poem, the first one is Lord Byron's She Walks in Beauty. So for Lord Byron's She Walks in Beauty, first thing to note is that this is a romantic poem. A romantic poem is a poem that talks about the beauty of nature. When you're talking about romanticism, it talks about appreciation of nature, writing about nature, and expounding on the emotions that nature has within it. And Lord Byron was a romantic poet. This particular poem, She Walks in Beauty, talks about very different things. First thing is, it talks about the beauty of a woman, because you know that there's concept of she existence there. How the woman is not only beautiful and attractive physically, but then there also exists a sort of inner beauty in this woman. There's inner beauty, and then there's even the poet Fasina inserts a sort of intellectual beauty that exists for this woman. So all of these concepts are put together by the poet Fasina to just glorify the beauty of this woman. Also, it gets to the point, the poet Fasina talks about how the beauty of this woman appears to be very balanced. Balance between good and evil, day and night. So there's a balance in the representation of this woman. But if you want to take the poem beyond the layer of glorifying the woman here, we can actually link it to the concept of nature, because Lord Byron was a romantic poet. So if you're linking it to the concept of nature, you're going to see how the poem is talking about the kind of beauty that nature has within it, a sort of beauty that goes beyond the physical and explores very different terrain, inner beauties, and other things that exist in nature. So this just provides an overview of what Lord Byron's She Walks in Beauty is about. Next one here is Geoffrey Chaucer's The Non-Priest's Tale. So The Non-Priest's Tale by Geoffrey Chaucer is contained in a collection of poems or work known as Canterbury Tales. So in Canterbury Tales, we have a lot of work. Canterbury Tales was written by Geoffrey Chaucer, and note that Geoffrey Chaucer is addressed as the father of literature and the father of poetry. And this work written by Geoffrey Chaucer, what brought about the sojourn to Canterbury was the death of St. Thomas Becket. There was a time in the history of Europe where the church and then the monarch had this issue, this sort of friction of who is the highest. Should the church submit to the monarch? And it got to a point, Thomas Becket was the head, was the pope, and the king wanted him to submit. The tension got so much that Thomas Becket left for France. He ran to France. But by the time he came back, the tension was still there. And at a particular point, the king made a statement on a particular day, a random statement, that can someone just get rid of Thomas Becket for him? His soldiers thought he was very serious about it. So they went to Canterbury and then they killed Thomas Becket, even dismembered him. That was how Thomas Becket died. So after that period, people started going to Canterbury for like this holy trip and all of that. They were going there to pray and all. So that's what exists as a background to Canterbury Tales. So this set of individuals were gathered, individuals of different stratas of the society, from monks to nuns to shipmen to tradesmen and other individuals who were all gathered. And they then made a sort of decision that every individual should explain, should tell a tale as they are going on their journey. So this non-priest tale is the tale that was told by the nun. So in this non-priest tale, you realize that the nun talks about a widow who had daughters and then had livestock. Of all her livestock, there were certain peculiar ones, and that are being focused on in the tale, and that's the hen, the rooster, and the hen. So there's a certain rooster, Chantlisa. The rooster has 7 hen, like 7 wives. But of all these 7 wives, there's one that is most peculiar to Chantlisa, and that's Pethelot. So at a point, Chantlisa had a dream. He had a dream that he was killed by a beast. And when he told Pethelot about it, Pethelot told him that he was just overthinking it, majorly because he feels dreams are not real, and dreams just exist in abstract reality. They don't eventually come to pass. So on a particular day, a fox that had been monitoring them saw Chantlisa and then flattered Chantlisa, telling Chantlisa to come sing. And the flattery got to Chantlisa. He begins to sing. But when he gets carried away, this fox grabs Chantlisa by the neck and begins to go live with Chantlisa. Now, Chantlisa shouts, and this alerts every other person. So everyone rushes out, and then they help Chantlisa. But one thing Chantlisa was able to do to free himself from the fox was that he also flattered the fox, telling the fox that why would the fox allow individuals to be chasing him like that he should prove himself. And when the fox opens his mouth, to speak, Chantlisa frees himself, and then he flies up to a tree. The fox decides to make move to bring Chantlisa down from the tree, so he will accost Chantlisa again. But Chantlisa is now wiser. So throughout the entire tale, one core message is the idea of how flattery should not be taken with levity. How the concept of flattery could eventually lead to downfall, where in situations or scenarios where a person gets praised and elevated to a certain point, it could actually cause certain things it is not meant to cause. So while reading Geoffrey Chaucer's non-priest tale, I would really implore you to just pay attention to what gave birth to this text itself, who Geoffrey Chaucer is, and the non-priest tale, and what it really represents. So that's for the non-priest tale. The next one we have here is Fleur Adcock's The Telephone Call. So for Fleur Adcock's, The Telephone Call, you would understand, first thing you need to understand is that it's a 20th century poem. And this poem was written at a time where the idea of modernization and modernity was really in vogue. A lot of things were happening. The environment was becoming more urbanized, and diverse things were playing out. And while all of these things were happening, technology was improving, and also there was an increase in advertisements, telecommunications, and other things. So in this poem, you realize that on a particular day, the first persona receives a call, and then the callers tell him that the call is from a universal lottery organization. And then this universal lottery organization callers tell him that he has won a sum of £1 million, and he's very much shocked and surprised about this. So he decides that so they begin to question him, stating that how does he feel about winning this money and other things. And he begins to share his experience that he feels so emotional, he can't really speak up and other things. But he now begins to think to himself that he did not play any lottery. So he asks the callers, and then he is told that the way the lottery works is from a very universalized perspective, where whether the person has just played lottery recently or has played a long time ago, it all still works together. Majorly because the organization, the Universal Lottery Organization, gathers all of the lottery entries from different parts of the world, put it into their system, and then select a lucky winner. On that particular day, he is now the lucky winner. So they continue to engage him, but after some time, he now asks a question stating how he's going to fully believe only if he finds the money. Then he's told, they break the news to him that they don't deal in money, they deal in experience. Majorly because they don't have any money to give to him. The only thing that they have to offer is the experience. That does he not feel good or feel very better now that he has shared his experience of how he feels to have $1 million, so £1 million. So you realize that at the end of the poem, the poet persona becomes highly disillusioned, very much angry about the way things played out, because the callers ended the call without saying anything more. So at this point, you realize how people were really after fame, how material wealth was a very important thing in the 20th century, and how telecommunication and the advancements in technology really played a lot of factors in things. So basically that explains Adcock's telephone call. So the last one we have here is Wilfred Woolfson's The Stone. So Wilfred Woolfson's The Stone, the poet persona is explaining one tragic happenstance that happened. There is a lover who works in a quarry, and while working there, he became mindless of the things around him, up to a point where a stone fell on him. And when the stone fell on him, he died. And after he died, the news had to be broken to his lover. But while the poet to go meet the lover, he realizes that somebody he describes as a poor fool has gone ahead of him and has broken the news to this lover. So by the time he gets to the woman could not say anything. She was as still as a stone. He describes her as a stone. She says nothing at all. She doesn't move. She's unable to cry. She doesn't do anything at all. So eventually he leaves, and then notices that for the next 3 days, the woman does nothing. All of a sudden, the woman shows up at his door and tells him that will he put the name of her lover on a stone, meaning when the lover, a male lover that is dead, is to be buried, there has to be a tombstone placed above the grave, and she wants the poet persona to carve a lover's name on the stone. So for 3 days, this man was, the poet persona was involved in this business of carving the lover's name on the stone. While this lady was seated, she says nothing, very much emotionless. But the moment it finishes, she sees it, and after seeing it, she sighs, and after sighing, she leaves. And afterwards, the poet persona tells us that the next night he had to stay awake again to carve her own name, that's the woman's name, on the stone. Meaning it has gotten to a point where she now decides that life is really not worth living for her too. And what that last line of the poem suggests is that the woman also killed herself. So in the poem, you just realize the concept of what so much a sort of immortal love between these two lovers, how the lady was no longer herself after her lover died in the quarry, and how that played a lot of role in what happened afterwards. And then you would say that the poem makes use of a tone that is very much intense and talks about real and deep issues that persist. So in essence, that explains Wilfred Woolfson's The Stone. So I want to believe I've been able to provide an overview of all of these texts, ranging from the drama text to the non-African prose, the African poems, and the non-African poems. I would just implore that you get to read more on all of these things. Ask, treat questions. If possible, if you have exam focus in literature, that's a very good resource for you to have to read and then get more knowledge on these things in literature. But with this these backgrounds and overviews I've provided, I believe when you read more on all of these things, you would have a more nuanced view of it. Thank you very much, and God bless you.